As we dive a little bit deeper into the internal family systems paradigm, the important distinctions are the parts of the system, the internalized father, the internalized mother, the internalized critical father, the internalized critical mother, the internalized nurturing father, the internalized nurturing mother, the internalized playful father, the internalized playful mother, the internalized collapsing and traumatized mother, the internalized raging and violent father, etc., etc., that all parts of the system, all parts of the family, which in turn mirror and are microcosms for the cult at large, have a part. And that each of these parts has, as with any system, a function. And each of those functions correlate to a perceived advantage at meeting the human needs to survive, to feel secure, to experience love and belonging, to develop self-esteem, to develop one's personal talents and gifts, to bring those out into the world and create abundance, and to become part of something bigger than ourselves. The role of every part is to facilitate the meeting of human needs from the environment. And one of the important things to understand is that all parts are in a child or adolescent state. The distinction is between the parts and the essential self. The self in this model is the adult. Now, the distinctions between child, adolescent, and adult are most pronounced when we look at the developmental cycle of love. The child loves by needing, because a child does need. Without the support of the parents, of the authority figures, the child will be dead in a matter of hours or days. The child needs in a very real way and is completely dependent on the outer ecology to meet its needs. The adolescent wants. So you go from need, I need you. When a partner talks about needing you, they're talking from the inner child. The inner child needs. The adolescent wants, the adolescent desires. I want you. And again, the adolescent is seeking to meet its needs through wanting, through acquiring, through lust, through pleasure, through getting its needs for importance, for value, for respect, for mattering, for autonomy, but getting it from the outer environment. Neither the child nor the adolescent are capable, nor should they be capable, of meeting their own needs. That's the job of an adult, to meet the needs of a child and of an adolescent, or not to have children, because a child and adolescent cannot meet those needs alone. The adult is the first self-generating stage of development. Once the adult is initiated, and this is a very important distinction, you can go cradle to grave in our cult without becoming an adult, without anyone defining what an adult is, without knowing whether you're an adult or not, or being able to map out the terrain. Are you a child? Are you an adolescent? As you migrate back and forth through different ages, is anyone tracking that? We track chronological age because that's what chauvinists track. The outer is everything. The inner is nothing. The fact that I feel 5 years old in this moment, 12 years old in this moment, feel ancient and timeless in this other moment, that's irrelevant. That's internal awareness. That's feminine. That's yin. It's not tracked in a chauvinistic cult. The adult, through initiation, becomes the first identity, the first core self that is able to first love its own inner child, to meet the needs of that inner child, and then love the adolescent and meet the needs of that adolescent. And upon filling up through competent adulthood, the adult naturally blossoms to look outwards, because that's where 99.9% of itself is. Because that's where 99.9% of reality is. It's out there, in the unknown, in the abyss, in space, in possibility, in femininity. 99.9% of an atom is space. A tiny bit is the particle. 99.9% of the universe, another fractal pattern, is space. A tiny bit are these moving objects in relationship with one another. And it is the adult that is capable of caring enough or loving enough to care, caring enough to take time, taking enough time to see, seeing enough to understand, understanding enough to empathize, empathizing enough to attune, attuning enough to succeed at, first, facilitating the survival, security, love, belonging, self-esteem, development of gifts, bringing those out into the world, becoming part of something more of the inner child, of the adolescent, of the adult, and then another. All human states are viral. This Emotional Life, a PBS series, accidentally studied feelings. That's how chauvinistic science works, is they do a study about something important, like liver cancer, over decades, and then they accidentally gather psychological data as a byproduct, and then someone thinks, well, since all that money was spent on the important thing, the outer science, maybe we'll just study emotions as well. And they learned that emotions were viral, that proximity to someone depressed determined statistically how likely you were to be depressed, that proximity to joy determined how likely, statistically, you were to feel joy. All human states are viral, and so is adult love. So is need, so is trauma, so is desperation, and so is adult love. Because when you have one adult capable of loving their own inner child, their own inner adolescent, and themselves, that adult starts loving others. The inner child in someone who is not an adult, whether they are a grown-up or not. The adult that sees the loathed, hated, disowned inner 5-year-old in a 50-year-old man who still hates his inner child for not being able to stand up to the abuse that he hasn't been able to stand up to his whole life. An adult meets the need of that inner child for love. You know, people are very funny in their divergence from science in psychology. I'm a gardener, and I would never go to a tomato plant and say, "You son of a bitch, grow. Enough of your nonsense. As soon as you produce some tomatoes, I will give you some water." But we do it to children every day of the week. Come on, get better. Improve. Then I'll give you a little bit of love. Grow. Then I'll give you a little bit of water. It's not the way a garden works. It's not the way the psyche works. You see stunted, regressed, arrested psyches. 5 years old, 6 years old, 10 years old, 15 years old, that do not grow any bigger and are surrounded in toxic environments of shame, embarrassment, hate, ignorance, fear, with messages from the cult that they are the problem. Not only do they not receive love, they receive toxicity, and we wonder why we have so many children. We just got through the Trump presidency and marvel at the incredible expense of having a regressed, shame-based child and adolescent running the country. Some of the highest per capita coronavirus cases in the world, increased homelessness, ecological deterioration, 28,000 lies tracked by fact checkers and counting, the dismemberment, invasion of the cat. And we say, wow, we have got to get this child, this adolescent, this sociopath, this stubborn, emotionally illiterate individual out of the White House, out of power, where they can do enormous damage. And yet there are no observers in reality, only participants. And when you have a country of regressed, stubborn, narcissistic, emotionally illiterate, dishonest, shame-based children who have not met their needs, and adolescents who have not met their needs, they will put their faith in themselves and elect a figurehead that represents the fractal truth of the American psyche. And what's the truth? That no matter how big the damage of having a Trump at the head of the country, or a Biden for that matter, immaturity is not one side or the other of the aisle. I think the gift of Donald Trump was transparency. He really didn't care if people saw the truth about who he was, in a way that many politicians are far more sophisticated in masking. Joe Biden is not an adult in many ways. You look at the sexual abuse protocol of dealing with Tara Reade. Assaulted, then fired, then denied help in nonprofit organizations to seek redress because Biden's financial influence on the nonprofits in D.C. for sexually abused women would not fund anyone who tried to help his sexual abuse victim. The Biden campaign will spend millions to cover up and spin the Tara Reade story, but they won't spend $10,000 to compensate her for a lifetime ruined by sexual abuse. It's not political. The purpose of a big government is to teach us about the government in here. A cult that is run by the inner child, that is shame-based, that fears the truth at all costs for revealing its inadequacy and the punishment and shame that follows, that's run by adolescent lusts and games and is profoundly psychological illiterate, does as much damage to their own life, to their own future, to their own body, as Trump does to the country. And when that is the state of a majority of our people, it would be a disservice in the fractal representation of the truth to have leaders that were miraculously and unlikely vastly superior to the majority of human beings. Biden and Trump's parents were the same as our own. So why would they produce people vastly superior to ourselves? It's not rational. And how kind to play out the true cruelty and mayhem of letting an inner child and an inner adolescent run our lives, because not a single adult, inside or out, was able to love us through the waves of pain and regression where we became arrested. The self, the adult, is the first state capable of loving the inner child and the inner adolescent, and thus becoming filled up. It is far more interesting to look outward than it is to obsess with inadequacies on the inside. And yet a child and an adolescent is stuck obsessing about their inadequacies because a child and adolescent has not received enough love from an adult, and they need that love from the outside. And when that love cannot come from the outside because their parents are traumatized children and adolescents, they desperately fixate on their inadequacies and trying to game the system in some way. What do I have to do? You know, we have the Forbes 400 list. Now, lists measure what matters in the cult. This could be the Forbes 400 list of the kindest teachers in America. It could be the 400 most generous philanthropists in America. It could be the 400 people who have planted more trees than anyone else in the world. It could be the best teachers. It could be the 400 best mothers or the 400 best fathers or the 400 best parents and measure and all of that. But that would be an intelligent cult. So we measure the 400 richest people in the world, regardless of how intelligently or sociopathically, regardless of how happy or miserably, regardless of how sustainably or ecologically tragically that money was generated. In the violation of the golden calf principle, the worship of false idols, we worship the symbol of value well beyond the underlying value it supposedly represents, which in Sonia Lyubomirsky's study on correlations of happiness and well-being and wealth, after around $70,000 in the United States, there is very little correlation between escalating income and sustainable well-being. It's not even close to something like keeping a gratitude diary or one's biological set point, which accounts for 50% of well-being. But we won't learn that in school because happiness is feminine. And despite it being the most basic innate drive in the history of humanity to feel sustainably better, we will learn nothing about that. We will, in fact, learn cult dogma about the worship of money, which is miseducation. So the self is the one capable of loving. The child and adolescent need love in order to become adults, and only an adult can give love to the child and adolescent. And we have generations of grown children having children and feeding on those children psychologically to still meet the needs of their own inner child and inner adolescent, which did not get met by their parents or their teachers, and now they desperately hope their infants, their children, their teenagers will finally give them enough love so that they can grow up. And of course, they don't, because children and adolescents cannot provide that love. Only an adult can. So in internal family systems, the goal is to access the adult, otherwise known as the essential self. And having accessed the self by differentiating what remains after letting go of the parts and letting the synergy emerge, we then start to find nourishment. We access a source of love that in most cases is not available in the outside environment. And we begin to understand, empathize with, and discover the part that each role played, that each person played, inside and out, in the acquisition, the desperate acquisition of human needs through manipulation, through intimidation, through shaming, through stealing, through blaming, through anything that is rewarded in the outer environment, in a scarcity mentality of regressed children with very few, if any, adults. One of our police chiefs commenting on the recurring arrest of juvenile African Americans said that in many cases, the young men he was arresting not only didn't have an adult at home, they had never met one. They'd never met an adult who could model that transition, that initiation into adulthood. The war on drugs is not a war on chemicals. That's stupidity. It's a war on human beings. And the war on human beings who are addicted is a war on the people who are in the most pain, which correlates to poverty, to racism, to ignorance, to brutality, and to shame. Something that enslaving an entire race for well over 100 years, and then doing very little to make amends for that violation of the self in oneself and the other, tends to produce. The war on pain management, the war on the people managing the most pain through addiction, is the war on the poorest, the most hopeless, the most shamed, the most marginalized, and the most discriminated against people in the culture. It is the persecution of a minority, and that is also a fractal pattern, because the war in the psyche is no less brutal, is no less cruel, as we take minority parts of every human being, demonize them, shame them, suppress, and deny their opportunity to contribute their value. We grow up murdering ourselves to survive. And when we look about how to externalize that program, we look at what minority we are going to oppress, attack, sublimate, and blame as the outer scapegoat that gives integrity to our identical pattern on the inside. Then we have some discretion in choosing whether or not to identify primarily with the oppressor, the masculine role, or the victim, the feminine role. Within chauvinism, the victim is viewed with more contempt, more hostility and hate than the oppressor because it's feminine, which is a lower level of status for both men and women. Women can be far more toxically masculine than men, and vice versa. Toxic masculinity is not about gender. It's about chauvinism. And when you have sociopathic, dissociated, blind, dogmatic programs and algorithms run in masculine women to either attack men or attack feminine women or attack their own femininity, you have toxic masculinity regardless of gender. Internal family systems is about differentiating the part from the self, which is a similar dynamic between the dot and the whole. Because we begin with the sphere, we begin with the one, we begin with all that is. The great womb of all possibility is feminine. The human mind cannot relate, has no identity as being one with all that is. And so it descends into the knowledge of black and white, into the knowledge of polarity, into the knowledge of good and evil, into the paradigm of yin and yang, and from there refracts all the infinite colors of the color wheel. And the whole is broken into parts, and the parts are defined by language, and language gives rise to the structure of thought. And the parts are masculine. The parts are about the wound, they are about the line, they are about the distinction, they are about the separation. And in order for the whole to understand itself, it must break into parts and look back from one part to another part and from another part to another part and to another part to see itself refracted through polarity, refracted in dots, in distinctions, in words, and in lines. And in this way, the whole knows itself in parts. In this way, the part suffers the delusion and illusion of differentiation and separation from the whole. In this way, we experience loneliness. The separation from God, Goddess, all that is, the separation from the larger ecological self, from the larger ecological equation, the larger mathematical equation that we are inextricably linked to. And we experience consciousness, human consciousness, through the prism of distinction, through the prism of words and language. And we gradually reassemble the whole. We learn more and more parts. We develop more and more complex languages, which are models for breaking the whole into parts and reassembling the whole with those parts. Healing. The wound of separation is the return to wholeness. The wholeness of the possibility field, which is spherical. At any point in the possibility field, the possibilities go out equally in all direction in the curved space-time continuum. You fly far enough west, you will come out flying east. If you fly far enough east, you will come out flying west. The wholeness, putting the sphere back together again, is the journey of coming home. To return to the place that we began, now not as an unconscious, undifferentiated ecological one, but as a billion, 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 billion pieces. As a dot matrix printer puts billions of dots to bring the whole back into view and know the wholeness for the first time, to come back to the place where we began and know it through the lens of distinction for the first time, through the lens of language for the first time. We are lost far out on that cycle, seemingly isolated, feeling separate from our planet, from one another, from other cultures, from other species, from the past, from the future, from our hopes, from our ideals. We are lost in the part. We have not come close to the return. But as you set out far enough to the right, you circle round and you find that you come up to the left. If you are truly selfish, scientifically, you want what's best for you. You take care of your body, you take care of your house, you take care of your garden, you take care of your car. Why? Because you're selfish. If you're selfish, you don't destroy your life. If you're selfish, you don't create lots of pain and suffering. If you're really selfish, you create a fabulous body, a fabulous life for you. Whatever is good for you, you do it because you're truly selfish. And first you create your own life magnificently, because that's what a selfish person would do. Is it better to have a magnificent life or a horrible life? I'd rather have a magnificent one, so a selfish person does that. But now that your life is moving well and you're happy and you've got all that you want, do you enjoy driving through slums and miserable people? Do you enjoy having to live in a gated community? No, I'm selfish. I want everyone around me to be happy. I want everyone around me to be abundant. I want to have lots of opportunities. In fact, I want everyone in my city busily creating new restaurants for me. And I want better streets for me. And I want better cars. Get it together, GM. Let's have a better electric car and let's do this and for me. And I want you guys to have good cars so that when we have an appointment, you arrive on time for me. And I want better food, learn how to cook and eat well so that wherever I show up for a meal, there's lots of food and I can eat great food. And be happy, for goodness sake. We know that emotions are viral, so I want to catch your enthusiasm. Be happy. Let's have beautiful streets. Let's have better architecture. Your house is run down. Here, renovate it so that I can drive by a magnificent house. And I don't just want to be stuck in this country. I want wealth all over the planet. I want healthy people all over the planet. I want a sustainable environment. I don't want to die. I want to dream of my grandchildren, prospering 7 generations down. I want to go down in history as having a great legacy. I want people to like me. Why? Because it's more fun than people not to like me. And so I want to learn talents. And I want them to learn talents so they'll realize how important I am. I want the whole world to be perfect for me. It sounds a lot like selfishness. Sounds a lot like selflessness. If you head in any extreme, and just keep going. What's good for me? What's good for me? What's good for me if everyone I contact is not sick? I might catch a disease. Let's improve world health. What's good for me? It's good if every restaurant I might possibly go in has all organic food, because it's good for me. You see, what's good for the fractal representation of the psyche, the ego, is exactly what's good for the entire ecology and everyone else. The most selfish person on the planet, following true selfishness, would participate in 100-fold improvement of every single person's well-being, the longevity of the planet, the quality of the air, for completely selfish reasons. And everyone would be so lucky that one person was that selfish as to invest in the beauty and abundance of the world. Now, if you head in the opposite direction of selflessness, it's all for other people. Okay, am I going to give them an ugly body? Well, it's all for them. I got to get a great body because they'll enjoy it more. I got to become a great lover so that I can make more people happy. I've got to make lots of money so that I can give it away. I've got to cure diseases so that other people will be curing this. I've got to help children so that they'll do this. I've got to do this and this and this. And I've got to see that everyone's eating good organic food. And lo and behold, so am I. So am I. I'm in that environment too. If you try and really be selfless, you will be far more selfish. You see, narcissism is not selfish. Narcissism is bad for the narcissist and it's bad for everyone else. It's not selfishness and it's not selflessness. It's self-absorption in a way that is not fun for anyone. So true selfishness and true selflessness, polarities unite at that interesting vector point on the other side of the sphere, where suddenly you've been flying east long enough, you start to fly west relative to a set point. All opposites connect. If you are truly cruel relative to a set point, you will end up being the kindest person imaginable. And if you are truly kind, you will end up being the cruelest person imaginable. Oh, I wouldn't want my grandchildren to have to work. I wouldn't want them to have to struggle to get A's in school like me. Wouldn't like them to have to go out and participate in the world. Wouldn't want them to have to worry about their future. I'll take care of all that. The kindest person condemns their children, their loved one, to be a puppet, to be a child, and stay arrested without the need to grow up. Suddenly you are far more cruel than the semi-abusive person who's launched their kid out of the house, who got a life and figured out who they are. So you have these interesting dynamics. In IFS, internal family systems theory, you have the self, you have the part. The parts are always destructive and have limited strategy because the system is always imperfect. And the parts always have a positive intention, and the parts always succeeded enough to survive if you're still alive. If you're dead, then their strategy didn't work very well. But if you're alive, your parts kept you alive. And they need to be honored for that. Now, the larger culture is just the parts macro. Your inner parts and all the inner victim, the inner perpetrator, the inner critic, the inner abuser, the inner rager, the inner dissociative one, the inner do-gooder, the inner pie-in-the-sky optimist, the inner desperate pessimist, they're all inside. And each plays a role in the system. And they tend to mirror all the personas outside. In fact, if you want to know who your parts are, just look at whoever you have any emotional response to in the entire culture. If you hate Donald Trump, you hate the self-absorbed, arrested, scared inner child that learned how to survive in a sociopathic environment. If you hate liars, you hate the part of you desperate to survive and realizing that telling the truth gets you punished in a shame-based cult, to lie. So, or if you adore this little part, oh, they're so cute and adorable. Some part inside, you may not have met them, they may have been silenced, but that's how you get to know who's inside, who you admire, who you envy, who you hate, who you despise. It's all inside. It's just you're psychologically illiterate. This has been sublimated and numbed. That has been deified as being real. And so your focus is on the self out there that gave rise to the self in here. In internal family systems, you get to know each part, you get to know each role, you get to know what it's doing. And the adult's job is to give that part love. Once the adult understands what a given part is doing in the system and how it is always intelligent at one point in time, but if you're traumatized and arrested in a certain age, it may be profoundly self-destructive today, but life-saving when you were 15. And in a psychologically illiterate cult, no one comes around and updates the model, because that would be bowing to feminism, to acknowledge that the whole world actually depends on feelings and psychological development is too much for a chauvinism. They'd rather ruin their entire life than acknowledge that there's all kinds of things going on a daily basis that they don't understand and that they attack in themselves and in others who point out their ignorance. And so this is the framework of parts theory. I've worked with it slightly differently. I referred to it as inner ages. I learned early on with my lovers that depending on where the relationship was going, depending on what stage the relationship was in, depending on which parts of me came forward, they were different ages. I could be with a 50-year-old woman and realize I was with a 6-year-old. And if I was with an abused, shame-based 6-year-old who expected to continue to be hated, it would be a miserable encounter. But if that 6-year-old was brimming over with love from an adult woman who loved her inner 6-year-old, then there was alchemy, then there was miracles, then there was magic. Which brings me to another very important part. The alchemy of innocence. The pre-language infant can become anything in any cult. There have been 10,000 cults in human history. The pre-language infant can become anything. It is in a feminine state, the state of innocence, the state of unconditional acceptance. And it will shape itself out of that feminine state into whatever is needed for the cult to see itself in it, which is necessary for the cult to relate to it, which is necessary for the infant to learn attunement skills and regulation skills to one degree or another of competency. The cult has to be able to see it. And so the infant sheds the parts of itself that are invisible to the cult and develops the parts of itself that fit within the cult paradigm. And so you have the stem cell of the psyche is the innocence of the feminine self. And that stem cell can go out to form a scapegoat, an addict, an abuser, whatever the cult needs for the system to work. However dysfunctional the system is, that stem cell can become anything within the cult system, within the family system, and does. What this means, as billionaires scour the world for the stem cells of young, virile, healthy human beings to perpetuate their aging bodies, is that loving and honoring the innocence of the feminine within men and in women with deep reverence is the most transformative, re-vitalizing ritual known to the species. It's going back to the source. It's going back to the one as it's emerging in the archetypal journey through the history of humanity and the process of growing from an infant to an adult, and then to a crone, to an old one, and to transcendence. That innocence of the infant is the stem cell of the psyche. If you can love, nurture, and cherish that innocence and guide it to grow in a way that illuminates, that sheds light. If the cult will bow to its infants rather than traumatize and shove its infants into its narrow fear-based boxes, the cult can become liquid, can become transcendent, can reach a state of competence and abundance where the empathic and transcendent brains of the majority of the human species are the primary operating system. It is the most efficient operating system in the possibility field of a human being, the empathic and the transcendent brains, glimpsed through psychedelics, glimpsed through tantric sexuality, glimpsed through dance and ecstasy. This field of play is induced when the cult honors and bows to the feminine in the pre-language infant, fresh off the press, the liquid gold, the liquid metal before it has hardened into form. It is the great alchemy, the great gift from the Divine Mother, the wonder, the magnificence of a child. Now, in chauvinism, we cannot see that. We see a scrawny, dirty, noisy mess, as already that psyche is put through one pressure cooker after another in the womb of an addictive and sociopathic home, afraid of losing one's job because one got pregnant, all those fear chemicals. We've already butchered so much of that before we even understand what we've done. And then looking through the prism of chauvinism, the infant is a burden. The infant is a source of economic strain, restricted freedom, because we're looking through the chauvinistic lens. Women and men alike, in our cult, cannot articulate what they in fact often experience, which is that it is the most sacred and amazing moment of their lives. To see the universe in the eyes of a child who does not yet know the knowledge of good and evil, who does not yet know the distinction of black and white, up and down, in and out, yin and yang, feelings and thoughts, but is still simmering, still effervescent from the untamed, from the unnamed, from the unknown, out of which it emerges to be cast into the mold of a cult that will mutilate much of its being, that will cut off most of its possibility field, its probability field, and its actuality field, cut down to less than 0.5% of what it was before. But to know that 0.5% through language, through thought, in a way it didn't know before. The work of parts theory is to get to know these parts, to understand that sphere that is waiting for the technology to emerge as an ego, as a species, as a family, as a community. It's waiting for the knowledge to emerge. The knowledge of healing, the knowledge to be whole. It's waiting for that. And we have no idea what it's waiting for, or what the screams and cries of dissatisfaction are referencing, because we have so thickly entered the dream, we have so thickly found our way into the density of identity, our pattern, however mediocre, however unbalanced, however sickly, however painful, our pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being, that we defend with our lives in the face of grace, that we defend until death, clinging to a mediocrity that, while familiar, hems us in, blinds us to most of who we are and most of the world. This is our state. We are in hell, the hell of isolation, the hell of delusion, the hell of identity, the hell of scarcity, through the lens that we're looking at. Internal family systems therapy is a way to get to know parts. In my case, it was a way to know ages. How old are you? What does your 6-year-old need? Does your 6-year-old feel safe with me? Does your 6-year-old love me? Does your 6-year-old like this? Okay. How can I love your 6-year-old? A few minutes later, there's an 11-year-old. There's a 15-year-old. We grow up when the inner layers of the onions become permeable through acceptance, through trustworthiness, through love. We grow through those layers and find the whole, the synergy, on the other side of embracing the pieces that are a small part of who we are.